Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing number 30, Aaron Dell's performance for the San Jose Sharks this season. So, of course, Aaron Dell was the backup goaltender, and he actually had some decently high hopes coming into this year. His previous year was quite strong, and he ended up getting signed to a 2-year, $1.9 million contract, which for most players, $1.9 million is quite low and is like third or maybe even solid fourth line deals. But for a backup goalie, $1.9 million is actually a lot and should put you up into the top 10, if not even close to the top 5 of backup goaltenders. And Aaron Dell did not play like that during either the regular season or even the playoffs. So during the regular season, he had 20 games started. That came along with 10 wins, 8 losses, and 4 overtime losses. Now you may be wondering, 10 plus 8 plus 4 gives 22, while he's only started 20 games. How does that make any sense? Well, the rules in the NHL are sort of like a bit weird, certainly, as Aaron Dell, of course, did fill in for Martin Jones, as Martin Jones was pulled a couple of times throughout the year. And so how it works, for example, let's take a game against the Vegas Golden Knights on March 18th. This was a game where the Sharks were trailing, it was, I believe, tied 2-2 before Martin Jones let in a third goal to make it 3-2 Golden Knights. At that point, Martin Jones was pulled and Aaron Dell stepped in. And so at that point, if the Sharks were to score a third goal in that game, which they did, the onus would then go on to Aaron Dell to carry the weight of whatever happened for the rest of the game. And so because the Golden Knights scored another 4 goals and ended up winning 7-3, Aaron Dell was dished the loss because he was the goaltender who had the game tied at a point, meaning he could have made something happen. And that might seem a bit unfair, but you can also put that on the other side, a game against the Chicago Blackhawks as well. This was a game that the Sharks were Martin Jones let in 3 goals early in the first period. He ends up getting pulled. Aaron Dell steps in, and the Sharks make a big comeback and end up winning it themselves 7-3. And since the Sharks were losing when Martin Jones was pulled, Aaron Dell stepped in, and he was the goaltender that was between the pipes when the Sharks came back past that 3-goal mark of the Blackhawks and won. So Aaron Dell was dished the victory in that scenario. And so just a couple of times this season, which is why the game started, is actually lower than the combined win-loss and overtime loss record. For his goals against average, he had a 3.17. Now, it is expected that for most backup goaltenders, it is going to be slightly higher than what you'd expect out of a starting goaltender, but 3.17, anything that ever gets above 3 is never good. And as I said, Aaron Dell was paid to be one of the better backup goalies in the NHL, like he was in the previous season. And it just didn't cut it during this regular season. Same with the save percentage of .886, which is really quite bad. And of course, goals against average and save percentage are both sort of flawed stats in a way. As goals against average, you could have a goals against average of, let's say, 3.00, letting in 3 goals in a game, even though you faced 50 shots. And in that same way, in a game where you let in only 2 goals, your goals against average could look good, but it's your save percentage that would struggle if you let in those 2 goals on only something like 16 shots. But when you put them both together and they're both subpar like they are here, then it just kind of shows that Aaron Dell just wasn't very consistent at all. Or I guess maybe you could say he was consistent, but he was mostly consistently bad throughout the majority of the regular season. To take a goaltender like Frederik Andersen of the Toronto Maple Leafs, for instance, he's a goaltender who has a goals against average that wouldn't look pretty for any starting goaltender, but his save percentage is actually quite good because of the fact that the Maple Leafs are a team that give up a lot of shots and give up a lot of goals as well. So if Andersen lets in 3 goals on 40 shots, his save percentage will be strong. His goals against average will still look quite bad. Aaron Dell here, both stats are quite subpar. Surprisingly enough, Aaron Dell actually had 2 shutouts during the season. That didn't really go a long way in helping his stats, clearly, even though 20 games is quite the small sample size, so you'd expect 2 shutouts would affect his stats quite favorably. The fact that the rest of them were quite bad just didn't really do him many favors. In the playoffs, Aaron Dell didn't really get much going for him. He never started a game, but he did get a single loss, of course. That was Game 2 against the Golden Knights. Martin Jones was pulled after it was 3-0 Golden Knights. The Sharks then tied it up with Aaron Dell in nets to make it 3-3, and as such, the onus moved on to Aaron Dell to try and get that victory for the Sharks, but because he lets in a goal and the Sharks lose 5-3, technically the loss went to him. And just in the couple of times he did fill in for Martin Jones, just mostly in the Golden Knights series, he ended up with a 3. .33 GAA and a .861 save percentage, so he wasn't really any better than Jones himself. For the grades, in the first quarter, he actually started off pretty good. He ended up with a B. It looked like it was going to be another solid season for Aaron Dell. There was even some conversation maybe he should get a bigger share of games and come, relatively close to what Martin Jones would start. But after that point, it really did sort of fall off. The second quarter C-, third quarter C+, fourth quarter C-. I didn't evaluate his performance for the playoffs because he only really filled in for the Sharks a couple of times, and it's a bit unfair to try and evaluate those times since they were when the Sharks were struggling during the first half of that Golden Knights series. But all in all, even though the first quarter was quite strong, the rest of it was pretty bad. Whenever he started a game, it just didn't really seem to go well for the Sharks. He looked at times quite uncomfortable between the pipes, and as such, a final grade for him is a C-. The Sharks will have to hope that he can pick up the pace going into the next season because he is signed for one more year at that $1.9 million mark, and he's certainly not playing like he is worth that amount. Class dismissed.